Alright, so in this lesson we're going to talk about how to use planar tracking. Planar tracking is commonly used for a lot of cleanup work and is the most common used tools for incorporating some sort of 2D element into your shot. It is the preferred method because it requires the use of what's called a grid warp or a warp sort of tool. And what that does is, instead of doing what we do with a traditional tracker, which is we track points, this is actually going to track a whole series of points, so little contrast, little areas here in, Cracker Barrel and Antique. So imagine a bazillion tracker nodes tracking every single area of contrast automatically, and then giving us a whole series of dots, right? And all of those dots are changing from distance from each other, and obviously and all that, and it's going to create what's called a grid warp map. In other words, it's going to basically warp the image as it's changing. So it's sort of like a flexible sort of tracker. So it's going to take into account any sort of distortion. So it doesn't matter what kind of distortion it is, whether the glass is an imperfect glass of the lens, or if there's heavy lens distortion along the edge. There's nothing in there that you have to type in actual physical information, such as the 16mm lens, like you would on a camera tracker, which we're going to get into. But it's just basically creating a series of dots, and then you can apply an image to that. So I have here from our previous lesson, the footage, and then obviously we undistort it, and then we have my old Antiques GIF here. So I'm going to go ahead and create a Roto node and plug it down the pipeline and put my viewer to it. I'm going to go ahead and click over here and create a Bezier. Now it's important when you choose the area that you're going to track for your planar track is a few things. One, you want to be able to track on a plane. Planar tracking by definition is the word plane. So what does that mean? Well, you want to track something is a flat plane. We know this is a relatively flat plane in our shot. And we also want to make sure there's contrast points. So you can see there's stuff in here that would be trackable if an auto tracker were to come in and track these little points. So that's important. The other thing to realize is that the frame that you actually start on is going to be what's called your reference frame. This is the frame you want to work off of when you come in and start applying and adding, putting a sign over it and so forth. Otherwise, you'll have some weird offset. So keep that in the back of your mind. That frame, in this case, frame 663 is our actual reference frame. So I'm going to go ahead and track forward here. And again, you can see if you take a look here. First off, I have to turn this to a planar tracker. You can see it's currently red. That's a Roto. But if I right-click on the Bezier, I now have the choice to make it a planar track. And what that does is it allows for the Bezier, which has a keyframe on the frame that I created it, frame 663, and then it has a folder called Planar Tracker Layer. This is going to be the auto tracks, just like how we use the tracker node. And if we need to do any offset animation, we could physically animate it here. So I'm going to go to my Planar Tracker layer here. You can see you could load it up here. Sometimes this says none, and you'll hit play, and you're like, why is it not tracking? Why is it not tracking? Always make sure that this is selected. And I'm going to make sure there it is. Sometimes it pops off. Okay, just be aware of that. So what's interesting is just like your original tracker node, you have translate, scale, and rotate, which is basically doing the same thing as, say, to a certain degree, like how we've been using translate, scale, and rotate in the tracker node. But now it has these other buttons, shear and perspective. We also can just turn this to just translate and scale, rotate. So this is basically doing what the tracker node did. And then you have shear and perspective. This has to do with any perspective, lens distortion, shearing, and so forth. So this is basically going to take into account all of those aspects. So with that said, you can see we have just the same thing here, exactly the same thing. We have the tracking that's very similar to the tracker node. And let's go ahead and just track forward. So I'm going to go ahead and click here, and let's back up a little bit. And I'm going to track forward. Now, I prefer to do track to end range. I set my range from 662 to 675, and I set this to global. So again, if I hit S for settings, I've set my frame range to 662 to 675. Not a very large frame range. Set this to global, and now I'm going to go ahead and track forward. So I'm going to go ahead and click here, and I'm going to go ahead and track to end. Now you can see nothing's happening, and this is a perfect example I was talking about before, because I don't have it selected. I want to make sure it's pulled down. There might be more of them in here. So I'm going to go ahead and track forward. And there we go. So look at what you see here. It's actually sticking to the antique sign, which is pretty cool. It's taking a little bit longer because it's basically putting a series of dots or a series of tracker nodes throughout the entire scene here. So it's making little tiny dots here, 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 here. And it's probably tracking points like, say, right here, or here, or here, or maybe here, you know, areas that you can really grab a hold of. I'm just kind of let it go through. Now, it's going a little bit further than I did because I didn't say the time range, but you can see if I kind of play this through, it's looking really good. Now, commonly this will happen too, and I mentioned this before. Look up here if you're like, you see how I'm scrubbing, nothing's happening, nothing's updating? Always look up here for red. Anything in red up here will tell you something's wrong. Like for instance, if I have my viewer gamma down to like, you know, all the way down, or viewer exposure, I could just click here and get out of it. But if I see red as in pause, sometimes this happens when you cancel a planar track, you can turn that back on and you're good to go. So now you can see it's updating. So I'm going to go ahead and drag down here, not up here or anything, but come to my first frame, and obviously I'm going to track backwards. But before we do that, let's take a look at the dope sheet. And I want to show you something that's interesting. So here's the Bezier. It has the one keyframe, right, on the frame that we started, our reference frame. And then here we have the Planar Tracker layer, which if you take a look, here are all the auto keys. So here is our, you know, actual Bezier that we can offset animate. And here are the auto tracks, which we can delete if we wanted to off of our dope sheet. So I need one more frame to track, so I'm going to go ahead and just come over here, track backwards, but I'm going to choose this, track to start range. And I'm going to say go from 662 to 663 and track backwards, obviously, and hit OK. That way I know it'll stop. I'm only worried about this area. I'm not doing the entire scene. There we go. So you can see we have this animation here, and if we ever needed to make an offset to kind of match it, maybe there was a bad tracking, I can physically take this and move it in, and now you can see we have an auto key on here, right? Or just a key that we set. So in the midst of this, if we take a look, we have keys that are on the regular tracker, but then there's also an offset animation happening from here to here. Obviously that's wrong, so I'm just going to go ahead and click there and hit delete. That way we're just back to normal. And everything is looking really nice. So what can you do with this information? Well, there's a couple things. If you come over here, you can, to your tracking, you can see there's an export option. And you have a couple of options here. You have corner pin stabilize. Let's go ahead and kind of play with that. I'll hit create. And what does that do? Well, it creates a stabilization. So if I come over here and I will plug the footage into the original lens undistorted, because that's what we tracked, and put my viewer to it. And I'll go ahead and hit Q. We are dealing with some very high-res resolution here. This image, if you can see if I hit Q, is very heavy resolution. This is 4K. So I might want to come and bring my resolution down to half for faster caching. So again, I just put this to half. And let's go ahead and just hit play and see if we can get a quick update. So you can see what's happening here. It's actually keeping the antique sign solid as a rock. But we are seeing what's called parallax here as the camera is moving in 3D space, giving us weird distortion along the edges here. Sometimes you could use this for a flatter shot that's not telephoto or a tripod shot, but moving shots, obviously stabilization will give you this very strange artifact, unless you're going for some artsy-fartsy thing. So I'm going to get rid of that, and I'll come back to here, and let's go ahead and take a look at the other options we can do. Now we have here this option here, which is our antiques. Okay, we're going to go ahead and put the sign in here using the first traditional aspect. So first I'm going to put my viewer to the planar tracker node, and we're going to make adjustments to the actual plane itself. You want to get back to the reference frame when you make adjustments. So I'm going to go ahead and click here and say go to reference frame, and that can put my reference frame here. At any one time, I can change my reference frame by going to a frame and clicking here and saying set current frame as reference frame. Now that's the official reference frame. I'm going to undo that. Just go back. I'm going to go back to my reference frame. And again, you always do this on your reference frame. So go to reference frame. And I'm going to turn on a couple options here. One, we can actually do what we've done in the transform node, which I can click center planar surface, and that's going to basically stabilize the image like we talked about before. So I'll hit it. So you can see if I kind of play it through, I think we're having an issue here with the 1-to-1 here. Sometimes you'll have issues, like weird glitches between 2-to-1 and 1-to-1. Like here in this circumstance, I'm trying to like look down. I'll go ahead and play it through and you'll see what I mean. It's just basically locking down the camera. If I go ahead and play it through, you can see it's locking it down. It's basically doing a stabilization. That's for you to test that out. I'm going to turn that off. Now we have a display planar surface. So I'll display that. And then I'm going to go ahead and display the corrective plane. And then I'm going to turn on display grid line. So these three little icons I've turned on. And what you'll notice as you kind of go through this is there's dark blue, obviously, which are keyframes. But when you get to the reference frame, it turns golden yellow. Okay, that's the frame, obviously, that we want to actually make adjustments to this. So let me show you what I do. I'm going to go ahead and click here and kind of get this to be parallel to the actual antique sign. How do you do that? Well, you look for lines inherently in the scene. We can see these lines are going to try to be parallel to these orange lines. So I'm just trying to get everything parallel to those lines as best as I possibly can. There we go. And take your time doing this. Don't rush through it. You know. So you can see these lines are roughly parallel to everything here. And then also look for like a parallel aspect of the up and down. There we go. All right, so now that I've done that, I can go ahead and hit play. And now you can see it's sticking pretty well to the background, or at least to the plane that is on the surface of the antiques. Now, how can I verify for sure that I'm not getting any weird drifting? Well, that's the beauty of this button here, the center surface. Now, again, I got this weird glitch that seems to be not working. Let's see if I go to 1-to-4 here. Yeah, it's still giving me a weird glitch. Let me see if I can. Yeah, I'll have to have it in the corner of the screen here. Yeah, it doesn't like me. Okay, so I'll just put it down there and hit play. And you can see now that we've stabilized the shot, we can look for any drifting in here. So you can see the second we get to the reference frame, it turns gold, and then everything else is blue. See that? There's like a little flash of yellow around the box as we get to it. So I'm going to go back to, let's go to 1-to-1 here really quick. And you can judge that when you have, obviously, you know, when you cache it, you can look for any type of adjustments. But I'm going to turn this off. I'm pretty confident that that's looking pretty good. But if there was any chance that I needed to kind of tweak it a little bit, I can go to another frame and actually come over here and click this and maybe make adjustments. And now it turns this sort of sky blue color. So what's that all about? Well, if you take a look, we have a keyframe down here set to an offset. Okay, so there's two of them here for that specific number. There's also a bunch of tools here, like for instance, label points. So you can see it's going to start labeling points here, like this right here, 0 to 3. And this is like, again, 2, 3. So what does that mean? Or I'm sorry, of 3. And you can see of 3. And here's the keyframe. See it right here? So I can get rid of that a couple of ways. One, you can go ahead and see here that, let's go ahead and come over here. Oops. And grab this here, and you can see I have this keyframe here. See it here? You can go ahead and click this little button and say delete the current key. So now it goes back to sky blue. This one has one as well. Again, I could just hit minus, and there we go. So it's important that if you do have an offset that you have it, but any sort of adjustments, anything where you want to kind of adjust things universally, you want to do it on the reference frame. Again, just click go to reference frame, make sure this is gold and yellow, because otherwise, let me show you what happens if you don't do it. If I go ahead and just accidentally like adjust it here, what you'll get is this animation. See that? So I'm going to undo that. And we're back to normal. So what can we do with this whole thing? Well, we can do a couple things of exporting via our tracking node here. We can choose corner pin 2D absolute. So I'm going to hit create. And let's take a look at that. So I'm going to go ahead and take this image and plug it in to the corner pin. And I'm going to go ahead and hit M for merge and choose B for background, A for a top. And let's put our viewer in there. And there you go. You have the general store daylight hours only system. I'm going to go ahead and turn off my corner pin. There we go. And let's see, we're getting some weird issue here. Let me check my antiques. And this has no alpha. So I've hit A for alpha. You can see there is no alpha because it's a GIF. It only has RGB data. So what I'm going to do is add a shuffle node. And I'm going to set this to RGB. And then for the alpha, I'm going to choose white. So hopefully maybe that'll solve the issue. Nope. Okay, so let's see what's going on here. So we got this. And let's see here. Let me turn on my absolute. There we go. All right. So now we have the sign down here as is, and it's a very small sign. Again, I could come in here and scale this up if I want. Go to my corner pin absolute, and there you can see what it is. So you can see the corner pin, the information here. You can see the corner pin, this is the actual pins, and then from we could say set to input. And now we have the input set to the size. So now it fits, it physically fits within the realm of what we're dealing with here. We can go ahead and move this around. We could also turn on motion blur. So if I go to corner pin and go to motion blur, bring it up a little bit. Now we have our motion blur. Obviously I haven't color corrected this. And this is where you can come in and make the adjustments to have it make sure it fits over the sign. So for instance, I can come back to my Planar Tracker. And I can come over here and make sure it's selected. Make sure I'm on my reference frame. And now I can make adjustments to this. Now, you're going to use the Q button to hide overlays. See, if I hover over here and type Q, it'll help me hide stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and try to cover up that sign as much as possible. And it's so important I'm doing this on the reference frame and not on any other frame. So I'm going to try to hide as much as I possibly can of this original sign. There we go. All right, cool. So you can see we have a very nice track through in the midst of this. Now that's absolute, okay? What if we had an image or something that we didn't want to have it stretched to these specific points, okay? That's where we can use a relative or corner pin relative. So I'm going to get rid of this, and we're going to go ahead and bust out a corner pin relative. I'm going to hit create. Now I'm going to do this on the reference frame. I'm going to go to my reference frame, right? I go here and say go to reference frame just to make sure. And I'm going to go ahead and say corner pin 2D relative create. Now I'm going to stick that here. Okay. And I'll put my viewer in. So what the heck does this do? Well, let me go ahead and first get the image itself. What that does is, you can see the signs down here, right? Is it allows me to make my own adjustments to this. So for instance, if I come in here and add a transform node and put it just before this, okay, and I'm going to go ahead and transform this puppy. So I'm going to hold down Control or Command on a Mac and left mouse drag over here so I can change the pivot point, or what's considered the center. And then I'm going to physically move this over here. Now, despite this being not correct, right, it's still going to distort accordingly. Whoops, make sure I put that there. I'm going to hold down Shift Control X and put that just after the shuffle node. There we go. Sometimes the ordering is important. Now I can put that in there like that. Okay. And this allows me to put whatever shape. Maybe I don't want to have a perfectly square sign. Maybe I want to paint out this background actual sign here, and then just put in maybe a circle sign or something. So if you have something that's not necessarily this specific shape, you can use this. So as I put this here, take a look. It actually is distorting into that plane correctly. So you can put anything in here, even maybe a circle, you know, peace sign or something, after you've obviously painted out the background here. And you can use that to whatever advantage you want to do. So lots of fun, lots of really cool things you can do. In advanced courses, we're going to talk about how we can paint out stuff and put stuff in. But for now, you can see what it is. So for instance, I can give you a better example. Let's go ahead and put a color wheel in there. So I'll just go ahead and take this out, and let's do a color wheel instead. And then I'll just go ahead and change my pivot point of my transform up here or whatever. And I'll just go ahead and scale it down. Oops. And go like that. Now, I also might want to come in here and add some corner pinning to this. So I'll add a corner pin. And stick it there. And again, remember with the corner pin, we have to say set to input, copy from. Oops, I'm sorry. Let's see, put this viewer to it. So the color wheel by default is going to the root format, which is fine, I guess. We're fine. So what that means is if I put my merge node, I can take this corner pin now, and you can see I can make an adjustment to this image. Oops, looks like something's wrong here. Let's see here. I think it's the transform node. Let me get that out of there. And oops, we're getting some inverse effect here. There we go. Set to input. I think we're good now. Nope, we're not good. This corner pin is a bit tricky. I'm just letting you guys know. Yeah, that should be it. Let me look at the corner pin by the image itself. Okay, that's working. And we got this, and then we have a corner pin relative. It's working, and now I merge it. Okay, now it's working. Sometimes it is, you get all types of weird artifacts you can get by just playing around. But now it has a more general shape and has more of an oval shape in this circumstance. But you're kind of getting the drift here. It's staying put on the image. So an absolute corner pin will take usually something square and shove it in the square center. Whereas a relative corner pin will allow you to stick, whatever piece you want in here. You can see it's not sticking too well down here. That can be a lot of things, a lot of issues. Usually because we only track this area up here. Let's see how that looks. Just hit play through. Sometimes if you get bad tracking or drifting, that's because you don't have enough tracking points in here. So you want to keep it localized to the area that you actually tracked. We only track this area, so you can see it's sticking a lot better up there. So that's a basic run through. I will have future courses on understanding this in a lot more depth, such as clean plating out the background images and adding in new signs and so forth. But this is just a basic understanding of the basic tools of Maya. That's why this is an introduction course. In all things, obviously, you can email me and if you have any other questions and so forth, but that's the basis of planar tracking. This is also used in stabilization with very telephoto lens shots, and it works really, really well. And those have to do with using what's called coverage maps, which we're going to get into in further lessons. But besides that, the next lesson we're going to get into is 3D tracking.